Hello, this is Mr. Reynolds, and today I'm sharing with you our lesson from September 17th on origin myths. In case you need the resources on Schoology, you will find all of this under week 2. Here we have the lecture notes I'm about to share with you. Here we have creation myth video from Norse mythology and text versions from the Roman, Egyptian, and the Norse or Scandinavian. At the very bottom, we've got some extra things to help you, and right here is your work for this week, the writing prompt on creation myths. All right, so we will start here with this slideshow. Origin myths. So let's start with what a myth is and what a myth is not. The word myth comes from the Greek word mythos, which literally means story. Mythology is the subject of or the matter of stories. That being said, it is important to note that we will be studying mythology as literature. Okay, we're not looking at ancient religions that nobody practices anymore. We are looking at characters, plot, setting, themes, all of that English class stuff, and we are applying it to these ancient stories that people told to try to make sense of their world. We are not looking at mythology as religion, which is matters of personal faith, right and wrong, good and evil, how to get to heaven or the afterlife or whatever the religion teaches to be rewarded by a god. That's something other. Okay, mythology, we are looking at stories as literature, just like we did Romeo and Juliet, Mockingbird, Of Mice and Men, anything else you ever read. We're just looking at the story elements, okay? That being said, when we study mythology, I tend to avoid Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and things that are practiced as mainstream religions today. I try not to step on people's toes in case you practice those religions, and we won't treat your religion as myth. We will look at the stories that are widely accepted as being mythological and no longer religious. Secondly, these stories were spread over oral tradition for hundreds of years, so there are many different versions of a lot of these myths. That being the case, there are certain websites I will give you, and I will tell you, use the information from this site. It will help you. There are other websites you need to avoid, such as Wikipedia. Now, many students tell me, oh yeah, teachers don't like Wikipedia because the information is not accurate. Well, that's not entirely true. They update their information a lot. They have a team of people who study the information, they make corrections, they cite their sources, and honestly, in my opinion, probably 90% of what you will find on Wikipedia is correct. Well, then what's your gripe, Mr. Reynolds? Why shouldn't we use Wikipedia to look up myths? It's like the game of telephone. Most of the myth stories, there are lots of different versions. All right. If you think of all the different Spider-Man movies that there have been, and then you try to watch Into the Spideyverse, all right, you sort of get what happens on Wikipedia. They take all of the different Hercules stories and they mesh them together and try to say, well, here's one version, and here's what happens in the other version. Here's all these different versions. And by the time you get done reading, your brain is swimming and it's just a little puddle of mush inside your head. Don't use Wikipedia, it will confuse you. They don't use student-friendly language, and they use a lot of different myths together and try to call it all one. It's like that game of telephone. It doesn't end up at the end what it was at the beginning. Okay? All right, origin myths deal with where things came from, and the fact is we don't know who came up with the first one. There was an original, and then there were lots of copies. We call these archetypes. And I want you to think of it like the Titanic. A lot of people don't know there were 3 ships, almost identical. There were 3 Titanics, if you will. There was the Olympic, the Britannic, and the Titanic. And I like this example because the Titanic refers to the Titans, which is a myth reference. The Olympic, Mount Olympus, another mythology reference. Kind of cool, huh? It's everywhere. But anyway, I think of archetypes this way. Some ship designer somewhere in Liverpool, England, they had to come up with a blueprint. What was the original design? That's the archetype. And then some shipbuilders, I believe in Belfast or somewhere, they took that design. They're like, okay, we got to build this. We're going to build 3 of them just like the original. You can almost use the word stereotypes there. The copies. The ships are the copies of the original archetype, which is the blueprint. We do the same thing with mythology. Somewhere in the ancient world, some culture came up with the idea of the sky being a god, the sky father. Okay? We don't know who came up with that first. We know that the Greeks believed in Zeus as a sky father. We know that the Norse believed in Odin as a sky father. So we just say sky father, the type of god, is the archetype. And the names of the gods, those are the copies, like the Titanic and the Olympic. Those are the stereotypes, the copies that came later that all followed that original archetype, the first one, the original model. Now, when we look at creation myths, origins of the universe, we don't have gods and goddesses yet, and most of them, they haven't been born yet or been created yet. We're going all the way back to the beginning of the universe, how it all started. And there are archetypes for that too, different versions of the story, and cultures around the world have common ways of telling it. A lot of it has to do with their geography. For example, in Polynesia, you have the earth diver archetype. And if that sounds a little weird, think Moana for a second. Have you seen Moana? The beginning of that movie? There's nothing but water. Out of the water emerges a goddess, and she starts creating islands from mud from the sea floor. That's earth diver. And as you can imagine, Hawaii, Samoa, Fiji, Bora Bora, a lot of those Pacific areas, the island nations, have earth diver style origin myths. Other cultures have what is called ex nihilo, or as my brother pronounces it, ex nihilo. I really don't know which is correct. I don't speak Latin. Pronounce it however you want. Just know that it means from nothing. In the beginning, there was nothing. Maybe a god starts to speak, like in the Egyptian myth, and things begin to appear. Where'd the god come from? Well, yeah, we'll get to primordial beings in a minute. But the god starts to speak, things appear. You can even look at the Big Bang Theory that way. In the beginning, there's a primordial ooze, and all of a sudden, kerpow, now there's planets. That's an ex nihilo myth. Okay? Or the Egyptians have another story. In the beginning, there's nothingness. A god decides to exist, and all of a sudden, poof, there he is. He thinks, therefore he is. He literally thinks himself into existence and then creates more stuff. That's ex nihilo. First there is nothing, and then there is the universe. It just appears. Another type of myth, for those of you who have seen maybe Avatar: The Last Airbender, this shows up in a lot of Asian cultures, especially Japan. You have the primal elements, earth, wind, fire, water. All right? And like I said, maybe you have 4 elements, maybe you have 2 elements, but some combination of original elements exist, and then things emerge out of these elements. The Norse creation myth is this way. We'll talk about that from Scandinavia, Iceland in particular. You've got a lot of snow and ice. You also have a lot of volcanoes. And so, as you can imagine, the Norse creation myth, in the beginning, there's an ice world and a fire world. There's your beginning. It doesn't start with nothing. It starts with elements. And since this is mythology, out of those elements, a cow is born. Yeah, go figure. Lots of cows. Anyway, that's a little bit about origin myths and the creation of the universe according to different ancient cultures. I'm going to let you discover a lot of this for yourselves.